Okay. Welcome everybody. My name's Steve McDonald. I'm the county manager here at Deschutes Title. Really appreciate you joining us today. Happy to have Steve Strode as our speaker, class presenter. Kind of needs no introduction. He's our real estate commissioner. He's been a past president of Oregon Association of Realtors and going to talk to us today about OREA updates. And one thing that he's asked is he'd like this to be kind of interactive as possible. So feel free to use the chat and throw questions in there, and I will make sure to ask those to Steve and get you some answers. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Steve. Take it away.
Awesome. Hey, good morning. Thank you, Steve. So yeah, thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And like Steve was saying, keep it interactive. I intentionally did not do a PowerPoint. I wanted to make it more conversational if possible. And also because I've got that cold that everybody else in Bend has right now. So I'm just getting back from being out of the office. So if I do go off camera, it's because I'm have a little coughing fit. But I appreciate being here. Yeah, I want to talk about a variety of topics today. And first I want to talk about House Bill 4058, and that's the bill that goes into effect. Part of it goes into effect January 1st, and then the remainder goes into effect July 1st of next year. And then I want to share some details of some recent administrative actions that we've taken in the last year or so, kind of to give it an idea of what consumers are filing complaints with us about. And then finally, I want to give some advertising tips at the end if we have any extra time at the end for that. So, and then, yeah, Steve's going to watch the chat box. So I'm not going to be watching that. So, yeah, Steve, feel free to, Steve, just to interrupt me if I'm talking and a good question pops up.
Yep. Can I jump in real
So first,
can I jump
House
in?
Bill 40.
Can
Yeah,
I jump in
yeah.
real quick, Steve? Sorry. Somebody let me know that the chat is not working, but the Q&A is working. So down at the bottom of your screen, you should have a Q&A section, and that's where you can ask questions. So just
okay,
let
yep.
everybody know.
I see John Ed Green. Looks like chat is disabled. Q&A works. Okay, awesome.
Okay, back to you.
Okay, great. And if I fail to look at it, Steve, just chime in. So House Bill 4058, that's the bill that was short titled the wholesaling bill. And it was first introduced in 2023, and it was covering wholesaling only. And then it was reintroduced in 2024 because it didn't pass last year. And then when it was brought back, it included some additional areas of regulation to include buyer service agreements and a prohibition against future right to list contracts. So that bill was not introduced by the agency, but rather Oregon Realtors working with the legislature. I think many of you know you have a realtor / legislator out of House District, I think it's 59, Vicky Breeze Iverson. So that bill was introduced last year. So even though it's still called the wholesaling bill, there's actually those three components: a requirement for buyer service agreements that goes into effect January 1st. This prohibition on future right to list contracts that goes into place January 1st. And then wholesaler registration. And I'll talk about what are future right to list contracts, and I'll talk about what is wholesaling in a little bit. So just a quick civics lesson. When the bills get passed, that's the part that goes into statute. Oftentimes in the bill itself, they'll have language that says the agency shall prescribe by rule, or the commissioner shall prescribe by rule certain things. And basically what that does, it's operationalizing what's in statute. So you've got statute and rules. And at the end, I'll do a quick jump onto the website too, just to show that as well. So the bill was passed in the spring, and then they give us this time before it actually goes into effect so that we can go through the rulemaking process. And so quickly about what that process looks like. So when the bill gets passed, we now started our rulemaking process. And what I did is in the April and June board meetings for the real estate board of this year, I got their feedback. I got their feedback on what things you think are important with buyer service agreements and with wholesaling requirements. So that was in the April and June board meetings. Then I reached out to the Department of Justice and said, can you draft some rules for us based on this feedback? This is a pretty comprehensive bill. It's the most comprehensive bill that's been passed since I've been in this office for about 5 years. So I want to make sure we didn't miss anything. So I reached out to DOJ, wrote some draft rules. Then we convened a work group of real estate licensees to give further feedback on what these rules should look like. We met a couple of times on that, further refined those rules, and then we go into what's now called a public listening phase. So it's like I said, it's multiple steps, and all this is required by statute and by law. We have to go through this very interactive process so that we get your feedback on what's important. So when these rules come out, it's not just Steve sitting in the chair writing out rules. It's all this feedback has come in from different sources. So we published the draft rules. We had a public hearing on November 19th. And at that point, it was an open public meeting by Zoom. There were no further comments then. And then we stay in a public listening period until December 9th. So that's where we're at now. I think I'll switch briefly over to show you where all that is housed on our website, and I'll switch back. So when you're on our website, you go into law and rules, and then this is where all of our rules are held. And then when we have updates, we put it right here under the rulemaking. The reason I'm pointing this out is if you ever want to be kept informed of the rulemaking process, you can subscribe right here on our website and get those updates. All right. So that's again, it's supposed to be as interactive as possible. So we want everybody's feedback. So that's where you find those. Go back to structure. Okay. So now that those rules are pretty much wrapped up, they're going to be published for January 1st. So I'm going to talk about the buyer service requirements, buyer service agreements first. And for those of you on the call who are realtors, this is kind of an unusual situation where this bill got passed in the spring, but realtor members have to already be using those buyer service agreements because of the NAR lawsuits. So the bill was introduced with anticipation that, yeah, there's the lawsuits out there for NAR. They may or may not get settled at that point, but Oregon realtors and the legislator who introduced the bill wanted to make sure that these provisions would become in place, regardless of what happened with the lawsuits. So what's going to be required? In the buyer service agreements, you're going to be required to include your license number and contact information for a supervising principal broker at your company. Now we realize in larger companies, there's multiple PBs. So you'll be able to decide who you put in there. So again, license number, contact information for your PB, a term of the agreement, and that cannot exceed 24 months. I'll get into that a little bit more later about the future right to list contracts. A description of your obligations. So what are your duties as an agent? You can reference the initial agency disclosure pamphlet because you have got to give that out anyway. Excuse me. And then an explanation of how you get paid. Because if you've been following these lawsuits, part of the issues were this lack of transparency around how buyers agents get paid. So you have to explain, how do you get paid in the transaction? And then the last thing, a statement of whether or not the buyer service agreement is exclusive or non-exclusive. So are you holding the buyer exclusive? Like you can be the only agent that works with them, or is this buyer shopping in different areas of the state, for example, and you'll handle them in Central Oregon, but if they buy a property in Portland or in Klamath Falls, you're not their agent. So again, exclusive or non-exclusive. So just checking for questions at this point. Okay, nothing on that. Okay. I'll keep going. Wholesaler registration was the other big part of the bill. And this, for those of you who don't know what wholesaling is, just a quick overview. So you're all familiar with flipping properties, right? Where investor comes in, buys the property, closes on it, flips it for a profit. Wholesaling is not flipping the property, but flipping the contract essentially. So I was use Steve and I as an example. So I'm the wholesaler and I want to buy right offer on Steve McDonald's property. And so I write the contract. Let's say it's really worth maybe $300,000, but I'm gonna write it for 250. These are fake Ben numbers, of course. Property's worth 300, but I'm gonna write the offer for 250 to Steve, but tell him he has no other obligations on the property. And I write the offer, Steve Strode and OREA signs. And then prior to close, I find someone else to buy the contract for me for 275. So Steve's still only getting 250. I'm getting 275, and that way I make a profit. It's called an equitable interest. We're selling the interest in the property to somebody else. So this has been perfectly legal and unregulated in Oregon for some time, and in other jurisdictions as well. And the problem that's come up is the wholesaler writes an offer on the property to the seller, and the seller doesn't quite understand what they're signing. They're under contract to sell, and they think that's the ultimate buyer is the person who wrote the offer. But then because that wholesaler buyer plans on shopping the contract to somebody else, he or she might put the property on, put the listing on Craigslist or put it on Zillow, Make Me Move, or things like that. And the seller doesn't realize that they're going to keep marketing this property to somebody else. And so they get confused. They complain to us. We've had complaints at the agency. And oftentimes it's the most vulnerable people that didn't quite understand what was going on. So there's no attempt to, this isn't shutting out any kind of business model. It's a completely valid business model. But what the bill aims to do is create greater transparency around it, so sellers understand what they're getting into. So what's going to be required is a disclosure statement to the prospective seller saying this is a wholesale transaction. It's going to describe what an equitable interest is in a property. It's going to describe what the seller's rights are if the disclosures aren't given and things like that. So really it's just creating greater transparency about what this practice really is. So that's what a component is, a disclosure. Everyone's on the same page, they're fully informed. The other thing that's going to be required is wholesalers must register with the agency. So it's not a full license. It's not like a full broker's license, but it's a registration. So you have to pay the registration fee with the agency, and we'll do a background check. So only individuals who have passed successfully a background check can be wholesalers. Brokers who are also engaged in wholesaling don't need to re-register. So their broker's license will enable them to still do wholesaling. So there's no new fee, no nothing like that. But they will still have to comply with the disclosure requirement. So there's basically two populations. Wholesalers who are previously unregistered have to get registered. Brokers who were previously doing wholesaling will now have to use the same disclosure statement. And then, I think, let me see, there's a question that popped up here. Oh, I back up. Okay, it's supposed to be. Okay, there's a question back to exclusive agency. Yes, you can define agents exclusively. Yeah. So that's the wholesaling part. Again, it's made to create greater transparency. The one that's unique about Oregon is some states only require disclosure and nothing else. Other states are requiring a full license, like a full broker's license. So Oregon took kind of a middle path where they're saying we're not going to expect a full license to do wholesaling because that appeared excessive. But we're going to do it more than just more than just a disclosure. So it's kind of a middle path. I think it's actually kind of a good approach. It's a good novel approach. Any questions on wholesaling before I move on? Okay. The next thing is what are called future right to list contracts. Those were nicknamed 40-year listings. And the reason for that is there was one major player in this space. And now that they've been sued and I think they filed bankruptcy, I will name them by name. I don't usually name companies by name. There's a company called MV Realty. And MV Realty was based out of Florida. And they had operations in, I think, almost all states. And what they would do is they would advertise to sellers. Do you need cash? Do you want cash for, I don't know, minor remodeling? In one case, it's on ad. Do you need money for gas? Do you need money for holiday presents, whatever? They would then tell the seller, you have no obligation to do anything at this point. We'll give you this cash up front, let's say $500, $1,000, pretty small dollar amounts. I'll give this money up front, no questions asked. But if you decide to sell your home at any point in the next 40 years, that's 40 years, you promise to list with us. And then what they would also do is place a lien on the property. And, title companies would see this. But the problem was, number one, the sellers may not understand what they signed. Again, sometimes it's the most vulnerable populations. Maybe the most in need of cash, immediate cash. They're like, okay, well, I'll deal with that later. Give me the cash now. And they would forget that they actually had this requirement in place until they sold their home. And they may have reached out to another listing company to now sell their home. So then you're under contract to sell. The buyer's under contract to sell, trying to close. And then you realize there's a lien on the property. And to get out of that, there was a very substantial termination fee. They couldn't call it commission because you can't pay twice on the commission, but it was some sort of termination fee. And that was equal to somewhere, I think, in the range of 3 to 5%. So in effect, the seller was having to pay the equivalent of two commission amounts to get this closed. And again, if these are more vulnerable populations, they may not have the equity in their home. It's any number of problems can obviously arise if you find this very substantial lien. And MB Realty is holding them to it. So it was a big deal. Also, what might happen is maybe the seller didn't forget that the homeowner may not have forgotten about the lien, but they passed on, and their heirs are trying to sell the property, and they had no idea what was going on. Maybe they would have used this real estate company had they known it existed, but they didn't know. So again, it was one of those last minute surprises at the closing table, or as a contract trying to close. So this type of contract is disallowed as of January 1st. Listing agreements will be limited to, again, 24 months. Getting back to the term in the buyer service agreements, also not to exceed 24 months. Same here. These future right to list contracts cannot exceed 24 months. Now, contracts are renewable. We know, or the authors of the bill knew that new construction might take more than 2 years. A condo development might take more than 2 years to sell. Unique properties might take more than 2 years to sell. So again, it's renewable. You just can't write the contract up front for more than 24 months from the get-go. Any questions on that? Okay, I'm making really fast time, so we got to make this last. I've got it now. I'm going to go into some cases. I've only shared this information in person before, and so when I've delivered this in person, it's been like 90 minutes. So I have to talk slow or something, but make sure that get some questions out there too, and we'll have time for questions at the end too. So not a problem. So anything else on this House Bill 4058 before I move on? Okay. The next thing I want to talk about are some resubmit administrative actions. And I'm going to go back to the website again just to show you where those are. Okay, going back to the home page. We have disciplinary actions. Now, we also put the disciplinary actions in the Oregon Real Estate News Journal, and I can show you where to sign up for that if you're not. So under disciplinary actions, we list them all by name. When I talk about them in classes, I don't give the person's name unless they're revoked. If it's a revoked license, then it's fine. They've been their violations were so egregious, we've taken them out of the business. I don't care if I give the name then, but for regular reprimands, I don't generally share the names. So the purpose of a reprimand is to educate, bring a licensee into compliance, and make sure that mistakes don't happen again. So I'm going to talk about some cases from 24 that are on this list. Okay, I'll go through those. And again, since I'm not using names, I have little nicknames for them. So the first time I'm going to call this one fake news. This one was a broker who transferred brokerages, and he had received approval to take a listing or listings with him from his departing company to his new brokerage. They had agreed it's okay to take the listing, and so they had signed an addendum to that effect. And so when the agent left the company, the coordinator or some office person at the departed company went ahead and canceled the listing in RMLS. I say RMLS because I think it was over the mountain. I think it was a Portland area listing. So they canceled the listing when the broker left. This broker didn't communicate thoroughly with all of his existing clients upon departure and get their approval to move from one brokerage to the next. And so that's where the complaint came in. A complainant, one of the sellers, found out that their listing had been canceled on MLS. And the broker texted his sellers, didn't even call, he texted his sellers and said, let me get the wording right. He said, your agreement automatically terminates when I joined a new brokerage. So they would be able to re-sign with him at his new brokerage. And I'm hoping you all know this, that it's the RBN, it's a listing brokerage that owns that contract and can only be assigned, moved to somebody else with the permission of everybody involved. So the complainant said, I didn't want to go to the new company. I chose this first brokerage because of either their name recognition or their reputation or whatever, and they didn't want to leave. And so they complained against their broker, like that, the way it was handled. And so the reprimand we issued was for both incompetence and below standard of care. Incompetence because his statement in the text saying that the agreement automatically terminates by him leaving the brokerage is false, 100% false. And then the below standard of care we cited because in statute we look at what are your practices among your peers for the best standard of care. And I think it's fair to say that you just don't leave your client and go to a new company and then tell them several weeks later that you left. So that was the reprimand. Any questions on that one? Pretty straightforward, I think. All right. The next one, I'm just saying, show me the money on this one. This is one where the licensee represented both buyer and seller. And the buyer included cash in their earnest money, according to the sales agreement. And it was a wallet of cash, more cash than I would ever have seen in a transaction before. So that in and of itself was kind of strange. Let me check the Q&A box first. Oh, thank you, whoever said that. They just said these are good examples. Thanks. So represented both sides of the transaction, got an envelope of cash. In the sales agreement, it was written to say part of the earnest money goes directly to the seller, and the remainder will go into escrow, into a deposit. So the second part's obviously very conventional, goes into escrow. So the agent failed to deposit any money into escrow and instead gave the envelope of cash to the sellers directly. And his excuse was, well, I didn't count it. It's not really my fault. I just gave all the money to the sellers. And so I didn't realize it was a mistake. So he tried to get out of it by saying he still gave the money over to the sellers, so it should be fine. But again, the contract was specifically written to say X amount of dollars gets deposited directly into escrow. So clearly he was not looking out for his buyers. And remember, this is dual agent. He represented both sides of the transaction. So in effect, he was favoring the seller over the buyer because he gave the seller all the cash. So that was one violation. The other thing we found in this transaction was he did not have a disclosed limited agency form signed by sellers or buyers consenting to disclose limited agency. So in that case, he was acting on both sides of the transaction and had permission from neither side. So clearly a violation. So that reprimand was for failing in his duties as a agent to the seller and the buyer, of course, because he violated both sides, incompetence, untrustworthiness, and below standard of care. So those are the reasons we issued a reprimand. The questions on that one? Yeah, I think this is pretty straightforward too. All right. Next one. This broker we revoked, so I'm just going to call it by his last name, Gottlieb. This was a principal broker who was engaged in both real estate sales and property management. And the complaint that came in was related to his property management activity, alleging that he was failing to deliver funds to a client. And so the complaint came in. Whenever a complaint comes in, we always ask for a response from the other side. So the respondent. We don't make a determination based on just an allegation. So we asked for a response. And Mr. Gottlieb originally did engage with the agency, and he asked for an extension for some additional time to provide all the records we were asking for. This was a couple years ago. I think it was an area in the state where there had been some fires, some forest fires. So we asked for an extension. Okay, we're human. We understand these things happen. So we granted the extension. I don't remember how many days it was, but it was, a decent extension. And we wanted some copies of the property management agreements, some client trust account documents, and some evidence about some reconciliation errors that we were uncovering in the documents that we already had. So then things changed. Initially, like I said, initially engaged with us, things changed. We found out that he put a sign on the office window that location was closed, and he put a new address on the door. It was simply a PO box. And so he didn't inform us of the address change, which is required by statute. And it wasn't even a physical address, it was a PO box. So obviously at this point, we start to think this guy is might be ghosting us. When it comes to complaints related to property management activity, we can issue civil penalties for failing to deliver those documents. Because again, these are licensees that are holding substantial sums of money on behalf of their clients. So we issued a letter saying, please provide these documents, or we may issue a penalty of $1,000 a day up to $10,000. We don't have that same leverage in just a real estate sales transaction, so don't get all onto that. But for property management, we do leverage that. So we waited the 10 days, again, totally ghosted us. Completed our investigation based on the information we had. We reached out to him to say our investigation's done. Will you come in for a settlement conference and meet with us, describe what happened, bring more information, bring mitigating information, and try to get this resolved? So that was the offer of settlement. He didn't respond. And then the next step in the process is we issued a notice of intent to revoke, which once again says, respond to us, or you may request a hearing, or we will proceed to a default. So there again, no answer. So then the next step, and all this takes time. Everybody has due process, so it takes months because there's like time between each part of the process. So after he did not respond to the notice of intent, we then issued a revocation. So it's a revocation by default. And so that's one where we don't need the licensee's signature on it because it's a default. They just stopped engaging with us. So his license was now revoked. We don't get to revocation very often. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Any question on that one? It seems pretty straightforward. Financial allegations, and he stopped talking to us. So he kind of self-selected himself out of the business, I think, in this one. Okay, any questions on that? No. All right. The next one, I'm calling it Mind Your Own Business. This one relates to a licensee who was a buyer's agent of a transaction that sale failed. And so the buyer exercised their right to unconditionally disapprove of a home inspection, you know, the language in the sales contract. And so they had their home inspection, and within I think it was obviously 10 or 14-day window, they unconditionally disapproved and they terminated the transaction. That was May of 23. In August of 23, the property was then relisted. Upon relisting the property, the licensee of buyer agent number one, the one who's no longer at all involved in the transaction, decided to send out an email blast to her entire local board about the property. And she had no affiliation to listing anymore. And she wrote, "Hello, LCBR." That's the Lincoln County Board of Realtors. "Hello, LCBR. I wanted to bring your attention to," and then the subject property. "This house is listed by a Portland realtor. I had buyers go into contract on this house. We terminated after inspection. If you have buyers interested in this house, please reach out to me. The list of issues with this house is incredible. A foot of standing water in the crawl space with active open wires. The foundation is held up by split logs, among other things." So this is an email blast that she decides to send 3 or 4 months after her buyer walked. So obviously the buyer, I can't remember if it was the buyer that complained or the listing agent. I forget who's the complainant. But clearly this buyer's agent number one had no firsthand knowledge about what issues the seller may have addressed while the property was off market. Keep in mind, it's off several months. So had no reason to chime in on this, no reason to reach out to her local board, and had no firsthand knowledge of the current condition of the property. I think it was a seller that complained. This was in August of 23, it got listed. By February of 2024, the seller still had no offers on the property and was still getting people to bring up that email blast from several months before. I think when showings were happening, the agents were still asking about that email blast. So we issued a reprimand for creating a reasonable probability of damage to the seller intentionally interfering with the exclusive representation of another licensee, and demonstrating incompetence or untrustworthiness. So that one, I think if I could all see your faces, I think I think I'd see a lot of head nodding on that one. Like that's just bad practice. So, any questions on that one? All right. Okay, next one's pretty brief. I just call this one dot your I's and cross your T's. This one, the seller failed to deliver a seller property disclosure statement, and the agent did not advise their clients of their rights when a seller fails to provide. And so I think what happened in this one is they might have found out things after closing, so that the buyer was never able to exercise their right to review not review the statement, but when it wasn't delivered, they were not told what their rights were. So again, I know you don't offer legal advice in a transaction, but you would advise your buyer on the fact that they should get the disclosure statement and what happens if they don't. So that was pretty straightforward. A reprimand for incompetence and failing as their duties as a buyer's agent. Question on that one? Seems pretty straightforward. Okay. The last example I have is this is a DocuSign error. This one is still kind of gray to me, but we can only act on the evidence. So this is how far we got. This is where we went with it. This licensee, again, represented both buyers and sellers in the transaction. And the buyers learned after the fact about information that was disclosed on a seller property disclosure statement, and learned that it was, again, never delivered to them. And I think they also never received a lead-based paint addendum. So, and also in this transaction, there was concern about the property line that was a property line dispute, perhaps as well. So, kind of a number of things going on. Didn't get this disclosure. There might have been something on the disclosure about property line issues. And again, the lead-based paint addendum never delivered. So that was a big one. That's actually a federal issue too. So what we found out afterward was this licensee, either in hurriedness, carelessness, unfamiliar with DocuSign, he actually routed the forms to himself and had it signed, and pretty much everything got signed on the client's behalf through DocuSign. He's claiming as an honest error. We didn't have proof. So that was just a reprimand for incompetence and below standard of care. That one was first time I'd experienced that one. But it gets us into other things we look at on investigations. This is a licensee who had been in business for a long time, had no prior administrative actions, things like that. His principal broker spoke to us as well and was convinced that it was really, really human error in this case. So again, we issued a reprimand on that. Any questions on that one? Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is advertising. So this just comes up occasionally. I thought I'd just bring it up because I know we have some time to throw in here. The advertising rules were updated a few years ago, and getting back to my initial comments about work groups, like implementing House Bill 4058, when we updated the advertising rules, I think about 4 years ago, we convened a work group of active brokers, principal brokers, property managers, to make sure they were updated because they hadn't been updated since the advent of social media. So they were, definitely time for some additions. The main takeaways from that was, well, number one, your principal broker does not need to approve every piece of advertising. Your principal broker can set a policy to still require it. That's totally the right of the company to set a policy. But it's no longer a rule at the state that the broker has to sign off on every single piece of advertising. Reason for that is because social media, every post, every Instagram post on a listing, sharing, technically counts as advertising. And we knew functionally that was impossible. So it didn't make sense to have a rule that's not even achievable. So number one, again, not required. Um, we get more complaints for advertising than I think we should. And I think it's because I don't know if we're in a hurry or what, but the key concepts with advertising, this one is easy, truthful and not misleading. So, you know, just be honest when we're advertising. The other one that does get into um, confusion sometimes is this proper attribution. Make sure you don't imply that the listing's yours when it's not, or don't imply that your team, if you're on a team, is the sole owner of the contract. No, the listing is owned by the brokerage, not by the team. So the proper attribution, a little more on that. We know that sometimes on social media, you may share a listing on Facebook that's maybe from realtor.com or Zillow or some other brokerage. If you're sharing, like, that share link for a listing, and it goes on your Facebook page, in all likelihood, especially like on realtor.com, it shows who the actual listing broker is. But you may say, hey, check out this listing. I'd be happy to show it to you. I'm a buyer's agent, things like that. You are still giving proper attribution to a listing agent because it's showing up in the top of the link. So that's proper. I think the main issue we have is when that's not done, like you just lift photos and put it on your Instagram page and we have no idea who the listing belongs to. That's a problem. Or this idea of teams. Teams are a very valid business model. No issues whatsoever with that. But remember that if I was on the Steve Strode, Steve McDonald team, but I worked for, I'm going to say Coldwell Banker is where I came from. Coldwell Banker, I'm not playing favorites. I'd have to clearly identify that I worked at Coldwell Banker. The Steve Strode, Steve McDonald team don't own the listing. The brokerage owns the listing. So it's really important to give that proper attribution to the RBN, the registered business name, who owns the listing. We tend to see where the Steve Strode listing is like this big, and then the company name is this big. And that just doesn't, that's not a proper. You have to clearly identify where the who's listing the property. Any questions on that? Pretty straightforward. Yeah, and I understand the desire to market under a team name, absolutely important. I was on a team myself when I was a broker. But, by way of background, I was in the business for almost 20 years, so I get that. So that's the one thing I really want to drive home, proper attribution. The new concept that came in under this rulemaking update was alternate name registration. So my name is Steven. If I advertise under the name Steve, that's totally fine. It's not misleading. People know that one is a common derivative of the other one, so it's never a problem. But if I start advertising under the name Alan Strode, my middle name, that's not intuitive. People wouldn't know that's my middle name, or that's one of my names. So if you advertise under a name that's not a common derivative of your name, you have to register that with the agency. You have to register it. If I started using Jack, because that's my nickname, Jack Strode, I clearly have to register that. Nobody knows that would be me. Register with the agency. And you have to then start using your license number in all your advertising, because looking up Jack Strode isn't going to show up on a licensee lookup on our website. So you have to use the license number as well. Again, only have to use a license number if you have an alternate name you're doing business under. There's been some confusion on that. We've had a few complaints where the the complainant said this licensee is not using their number in their advertising, and it wasn't required. I think the confusion exists because mortgage brokers have to do it. I think contractors might have to use their number as well. So it's not always the same among different industry. So that has to be done. I see a Q&A here. What if NBN authorizes smaller font? What's an NBN? Does it mean RBN? If you could follow up with that. Oh, RBN. Okay. If the RBN authorizes a smaller font. Well, there's no font size requirement in advertising rules. It just has, I think the language is, it must be, was it immediately noticeable, I think is the language. There can be different font sizes, but if it's deliberate that you're making the RBN micro font and the team name macro font, that's where it comes in. The work group that convened on this issue intentionally stayed away from font sizes. Some states have done that. Some states have said equal font or no smaller than 12 font or something like that. We've stayed away from it. So it's really a judgment call if a complaint comes in. So really, that does offer us some, like I said, some latitude in deciding. So we're just gonna use our best opinion on that if a complaint comes in. Yeah, thanks, Regan. Yeah, that was the one thing in the work group that we went around circles on 10 times. Is like, we want to do font sizes. Do we have to say team is equal to RBN size? And the group just said, you know what, let's just let it be complaint driven. Doesn't happen very often. Let's give some authority to or latitude to the agents, to the industry to decide for themselves. So there's a question in the box that said, years ago, I was told by the state that Ed was fine, although my license name is John E. Green. More recent years, I have been doing what you just said, using my first name, identifying as John Ed Green. See, that makes sense. That's a great way. You know, by putting in quotes, you show that it's kind of a nickname, and then put your license number. That's fine. Yeah. Back to digital signatures. There's a question in the chat box. What other digital signature issue complaints do you encounter? We have not really had a lot of those. Digital signature complaints. No, I think we've had some where they failed to route it to one person over another. Like they didn't route it to both parties in a transaction. Like maybe Mr. and Mrs. Seller, for example, that type of thing. But overall, this actually brings me up to a related issue. When we get complaints, I think I'll close on this actually. When we get complaints, first and foremost, generally, most complaints get closed before a full investigation is completed. Generally, as a population, you all do a great job of like keeping good records. And then when the complaint comes in, you can share with us what happened in the transaction. You can send us your email thread, your text thread, you know, do screenshots of your text and show us what your communication was between you and the client. That's been especially helpful in recent years when it's an extremely competitive environment and you had clients that were waiving inspections or waiving things like that, waiving appraisals. And then they have buyer's remorse after closing and think, oh God, I found this issue about my house. The agent should have told me this. Well, if they were at a home inspection, they would have known about it. So document, and then keep those for us. And then when if a complaint does come in, you can share with us what your communication was. And then generally it's resolved. That was not answering Terrence's question directly, but we don't have a lot of actual signature issues. It's more about documentation, keeping that documentation handy. Yep. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to share screen, and I'm going to share just a few ways that you all can keep in touch with us or keep up to date with us. Okay, like the homepage. This is one where I'd ask for a show of hands, who gets the Oregon Real Estate News Journal. So for those of you who don't know, we issue a journal every quarter. I'm on the homepage of our website, Oregon Real Estate News Journal. On the bottom link, this is where you can see all the previous issues. And it comes out quarterly. If you want to subscribe, go to the web and just put your email address in there, and you'll get the journal every quarter. We try to have helpful information there. We also put all of our most recent administrative actions. I know historically that's the first thing people read. When we look at click-through rates, it's the one they all go to because you want to see who's in trouble. And again, I know it's kind of there's that interest in seeing what's out there, but it's meant to be a source of education. So go through these, read what our decisions are, and click on them. If you notice, there's a disproportionate number of violations right now that are property management. Property manager, and even if you click on some of the brokers and principal brokers, when you click through, the issues in theirs also happen to be property management related. It's a big issue right now. The one that is you may want to reference or look back at this Valerie White case, that was a revocation. A lot of consumers affected, property owners affected by that one. And this is one where sometimes cases cross over to the legal realm potentially as well, the law enforcement realm. So anyway, that's where all those are listed. So I want to show you that. So disciplinary actions, Oregon Real Estate News Journal, laws and rules. This is one where these are not exciting to read. They're boring as heck. But this is also where you can stay up to date on the rulemaking process. So you can subscribe to our administrative rule update service. Anytime there's new rules, you get notified of that. This final one, this is the notice of rulemaking for House Bill 4058. All the things I talked about during the earlier part of the presentation with wholesaling, buyer service contracts, and future rentalist contracts, they're all in here. It's not going to show up on the screen, but I'm not downloading, but well, yeah, I guess it will. This is where all the rules are filed right there. So again, feel free to play around on the website, look for things. But that is what I wanted to cover today, and we did get to the 50-minute minimum. So what other questions do you have? Anything else? Well, thanks for suffering through my nasal congestion, and I didn't even cough. That was good. Any other questions though? Before we wrap up? Anything from Steve?
Nope. I
Actually, somebody just popped up here.
Yeah,
Thank you, guys. Yeah, I really appreciate you being here. Yeah.
Yeah, Steve, I just echo what everybody's saying in the comments, which is very good information. And honestly, appreciate your being out front and visible and helping us understand how we can comply with the rules better. It's very good information.
Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah, it's good to be here. Yeah, if you have any questions afterward, feel free to reach out to me. The chat box is turned off. I'm just going to put my email address in the. Actually, I really can't. Can I put my email address in there somewhere?
You should be able to in the Q&A maybe. I think everybody be able to see it there.
Okay, what? Not working. Oh well. Answered. Oh well. Well, you know what? I'm on the website. So if you have any questions, call me. We'll go from there.
Okay, great. Really appreciate it. Everybody, thank you for attending. We will get certificates out. Hopefully it should be first part of next week. at the latest, and wish everybody happy holidays, and thanks for attending. Have a
Hey,
great
take
day.
care. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it. See ya. Bye.